back to another episode of the Catholic Buzz podcast. Thanks for joining us today as we continue our conversation during the season of Lent. My name is Father Daniele, and I'm joined, as always, by Josh Sullivan.
Hello.
Welcome to you, Josh.
Thank you.
And Matt Van Milgen.
Hello.
Welcome to you, Matt.
Thank you.
So today we're continuing on in our Lenten journey, and a huge part of our practice during Lent is the tradition to pray with the Stations of the Cross. And probably, I would say, every Catholic church you go to in the world has Stations of the Cross, images of the stations on the sides of the church or wherever, depends on what the architecture of the church is, but there are mostly scenes depicted of Jesus, moments of Jesus on his way to his passion and death. And so that's something that we do during the season of Lent, especially. We pray the Stations of the Cross. We go from station to station to station, meditating on each scene and each moment of the passion of Jesus. And it doesn't have to be just a Lent thing, but it's very popular during the season of Lent and less popular outside of the season of Lent, but still a legitimate way to pray to unite ourselves to the passion and death of Jesus. So that's why it's more typical during Lent, because we highlight those things during Lent. But, there's a storied history here of the Stations of the Cross, because when you go to churches, you are most likely to see the sort of standardized Stations of the Cross that you would see across churches, but it wasn't always that way. It wasn't always 14 stations like you see depicted in most churches right now. It has a varied sort of history starting all the way back to Mary herself, we think, that the tradition shows, right?
The tradition suggests that Mary visited, I thought it was every often, but Matt, you corrected me saying that it was every daily. We found it there, that every day she would do the Stations of the Cross, meaning she would follow the way that Jesus went and where he died, like from where Pontius Pilate was to where he died. And that's how the story goes. I find that to be just craziness. Like, if you just watch your son die, why would you go back through that same horror every single day? So I don't know about that. I don't know, but it's tradition. And so, what happened was pilgrims would follow her on that, and eventually got to the point where I think we have some mention of it in the 3rd to 4th century, the 4th century. Somewhere in there, they talk a little bit about this sacred way, the way of the cross, or not the way of the cross is not called, but it's the sacred way. And the idea being this road or this journey where you would pilgrimage to this spot in Jerusalem, and you would go and take the steps that Jesus kind of took. And the steps, as we were talking, the steps went anywhere from 7 to 30, or even more than that. And when you go to the Station of the Cross, you stop at each specific spot, and the stations around a church, you would stop at each station, you'd meditate on that station, maybe do a Bible reading of some sorts, or to bring you into that, what's going on there, and then you'd move to the next station, and you'd relive that way all the way. Well, they would actually walk that, and then they would stop at every specific spot. Now, chapels have been erected in Jerusalem along the way that is believed to be taken, that Jesus takes. And so there are different shrines and chapels that are there that we have. But eventually it got to the point where pilgrimage to the Holy Land was pretty costly, and so people couldn't necessarily do that.
Or at some points in history, dangerous.
Oh, dangerous! Yeah. Like when Saladin took over, when the Sultan, when the Muslims came in and they took over Jerusalem and they ruled Jerusalem, you couldn't be a Christian there in Jerusalem, and so it wasn't safe to go there anymore. And so then what they started taking was memorabilia back from those shrines and those places, and they started putting them up on the walls, and so that they could do like a kind of like what we did during COVID, if you will. Like, we can't do this whole thing, so we're going to make up a new tradition to try to figure out how to still believe, still worship, still do the things that are important to us. And so they started to do these stations as we know them today, or the Way of the Cross, as it was called. And so the Sacred Way. And they would go to each of these stations throughout the thing. But yeah, there's a lot of cool history, a lot of cool different things. Like, for instance, we have 14 stations that were solidified about 200 or 300 years ago. But that wasn't the case. right?
I want to go back to what you said about Mary walking the daily scenes of the Lord's Passion. So yes, tradition holds that she would walk the path that Jesus did every day as sort of a remembrance of her of what happened to Jesus, right? So I'm just been thinking about that since you mentioned that, and I bet you she wasn't alone. And
No,
people were
yeah.
walking with her on these steps, right? Each moment, and they were probably telling the story, like, "Oh, this is when he fell, or this is when the crowd. Remember, Simon was standing over there, and they called him over, or whatever." You could just picture them sort of walking
Reliving-
these steps and reliving the moments, and that's sort of makes sense where the tradition comes from. You see kind of a empty history of the Stations of the Cross for the first 300 years because Christianity was illegal until the year 312, right? When Constantine legalized Christianity. But it was St. Jerome who actually testified or attested to the fact that people were coming to these holy places and making a pilgrimage to these spots. Of course, that's in the 4th century after Christianity was legalized. But St. Jerome wrote about that people were gathering and walking on these areas and pointing out, and you can kind of picture them, because I'm picturing the Stations of the Cross today. You do them in the middle of a church. You have like a little prayer booklet with you, and you're meditating and you're praying together and all these different things, right? But there, you're sort of... You don't have a prayer booklet.
No.
You're probably stopping and you're recounting the story. Someone is, telling the story. So it's passed down or
even
whatever.
shrines erected, and maybe there are, like you suggested, like there's little chapels or little shrines that are built in these places to say that this is, and that's why, we don't know, like up to 30 stations at a time, potentially, depending on, and that could be every aspect of the Passion, right? And so from seven was really popular for my research, and so they said a lot of people said 7, and that makes sense because 7 is that holy number. We like the number 7 in the Christian church, but then up to 30, and so then they would be like, it was a pilgrimage. Once Jerusalem became kind of off limits to Christians, they really started moving it then into like England, into Italy, and into the other places where they would make little pilgrimages around the town or around the churches. Specifically, though, it was the Franciscans that really spread this devotion to the way of the cross, because they were in charge of Saint Francis took on the role of guarding or taking care of or uplifting the holy places in Jerusalem. And in doing that, I think it was 200 years later, one of the popes declared, okay, the Franciscans, now you guys are in charge of this. And so the Franciscans took care of a lot of these shrines.
Still to this day,
there's
Franciscans there in the Holy Land monitoring the Holy Land where Jesus was, right?
Yeah.
You could picture interesting because the whole point of the stations was to reproduce them in a way for those who couldn't actually travel to the Holy Land. And I'm just thinking, like, when we pray the stations in our parish or wherever, you're kind of going station to station, you're kind of saying the prayers, but that adds sort of a depth to the prayer.
When you're walking?
It's like we're looking at this image right now. The reason why we have this image on the wall is because we can't actually be in the very spot that it happened. Doesn't that add a depthness to what we're doing? Like, we're walking this way of the cross. We're walking the Stations of the Cross. Sure, it's in our own building, but the whole point is for us to be placed there.
Yeah.
It kind of adds like another level to the spiritual side of it.
And as a spiritual pilgrimage, like you said, like you can go on an actual pilgrimage. You can go to Jerusalem. You can retrace the steps. But like as a spiritual practice, it goes what we were saying last week about like exegesis and eisegesis. That it's like you can have good theology about the salvific work of Christ on the cross, or like, but as a discipline, as a devotion. The way of the cross or Stations of the Cross is an invitation to inhabit, the perspective of Mary, the perspective of people who were witnessing, the perspective of Simon in being asked to carry Christ,
cross.
to bear Christ's cross with him. That's
Yeah.
the invitation to all Christians. That it's again, it's being able to put yourself in that situation, put yourself in that perspective, to have a deeper understanding, a deeper appreciation of the suffering of Christ. But again, pointing towards the resurrection, which maybe is kind of a segue into what you were saying about Mary, because like there's some people have a hard time with the stations, and whether or not it's worthwhile to meditate just on the suffering of Christ, in isolation of the resurrection. And even the fact that we find that idea that Mary would do this daily, like if that's a traumatic life event, why would you want to repeat that? Why would you want to keep? I mean, again, it's a testament to Mary's faith. But also that a lot of people would look at just the crucifixion as kind of a hopeless defeat of, because, and that's how the Romans saw it.
Yeah.
This we've killed Christianity. We've killed this movement that's, in opposition to the Roman Empire. But, the irony of, the instrument of torture ends up becoming the instrument of our salvation. Again, we have that invitation again to identify with the suffering of Christ, to unite our suffering to His, but again to really feel it. Like, and again, Lent is that kind of time of year that we set aside to actually to contemplate this stuff seriously, because again, a lot of times we want to. It's more comfortable to live in the joy and the freedom of the resurrection, but again, there is merit and there is value even for Mary. Who doesn't need the same kind of, is the full recipient of the grace that we actually need, or that we actually get from this discipline or this devotion. But again, it's an opportunity to really put on that perspective, to really understand and appreciate the suffering of Christ in its fullness, because again, that adds to, or that gives significance to the glory of the resurrection. We are raised up with Him.
There's some really cool saints that have reflected on that when you're talking about Mary, because one of the ways of the cross that really kind of touched me. I remember a long time ago, one of the first times I heard it was Mary's Way of the Cross, and seeing the whole thing. I can't remember who wrote it or when it came about. Lots of saints, especially in the medieval time period, from like the 1200s to the 1500s. That area, there's a lot of ways of the cross that kind of came out from a lot of different saints too. So even Saint Francis had a very specific one. Saint Clare of Siena, Saint Alphonsus Liguori, and so they all had and I think Saint Alphonsus is probably one of the most famous. I think that you see a lot of churches and stuff is his Way of the Cross. But you have all these other, but one of them was Mary. What I remember is doing a Mary's Way of the Cross and just seeing every station through Mary's eyes, as she would have been there following, as we know through tradition and scripture, that she was there following. And so she would have seen each of these through Mary's. And I was like, oh, that was really powerful for me, seeing it that. And I love the fact that because we have these stations, now, I mean, again, 200-300 years ago, were defined specifically now as these types of traditional, more 14 stations. What happened there was that the Franciscans asked to put it up in their church. These up some stations in the church, and the Pope granted them the authority to put stations in the church, so these images into the church to help with this devotion in the Franciscan monastery at the time, and then he allowed the churches, a little while later, he allowed the churches all around to do the same if it was a Franciscan that erected the stations. So it was under the guidance of the Franciscan order. And then eventually it got to the point where a couple hundred years later that it didn't have to be Franciscans anymore. It just as the local in cooperation with the Franciscan and the local bishop, and then it became just the local bishop has to allow it, and then it just pretty much everywhere. So you have them all over the place, but you have different types and different ways of looking at it through different eyes, through different ways of studying. Yeah. But just recently, like just in the studying for the podcast, I didn't realize, but like we have other stations that like Pope JP2 introduced, and he introduced them as early as when he was still, I don't know if he was bishop or cardinal or what he was at the time, maybe even just a priest, but 1975 apparently there was a scriptural way of the cross, which was because I think one of the things that we have as a problem, and I know that this is something that our teens ask us sometimes when we're going around doing the stations, is like, well, where's this in Scripture? Like, where's Jesus's first fall, second fall, third fall? Where is Veronica in the Scriptures? And the truth is, they're not. We know, and we can surmise through tradition and through other things that these specific things happen. We have veils. We have the story of Veronica and the veil in the church history going way back, I think, to like the 4th century. And so like we have all these traditions and stuff, but some of the ways are not necessarily there. And so JP2 has put together, I think it came out in 1991 where he started to make it official, was the way of the cross, the scriptural way of the cross. And so this takes into different accounts, different things that you would meditate upon, but are all scriptural based. And so it starts right off at like the Last Supper type thing is kind of where it starts. The Garden of Gethsemane, the betrayal of Judas, and then kind of goes and moves into Jesus gets arrested and then turned over at the
Sanhedrin. Yeah.
Thank you. and then Pontius Pilate, and then scourging, and then it almost actually very much follows our our mysteries of the Rosary to some extent.
Yeah.
So like the 5 mysteries of the Rosary are all in there. You know what I mean? But then he's given, like, I think the first one is Pilate that we would traditionally be used to would be Pilate in front of Jesus, and that's the first one that we normally have. Well, in the scriptural Rosary that JP2 introduced, that was number 5, I think, station number 5, and then taking of the cross was station number 2 in the traditional sense, and it's actually station number 7. And so it's slow, like it takes on a different approach, but it's all scriptural based. And so that's the one that the Holy Father celebrates, or that I'm going to say the Vatican and the Rome celebrate in the Colosseum ever since he introduced it, pretty much. And so that's the scriptural one that is based. Now, most of the churches have these ones from the Franciscan era. Of the 14 stations, because the Pope, when he allowed them to put the stations up, he limited it to 14, and he said this is where to go, like, you know. And so they kind of made that replication. And there was one very specific saint, I can't remember his name, but he was the one, he made like he introduced it to over 537 churches or something. He's a saint now, Saint Pierre, I think, and he went around and he was a monk, he was a Franciscan, and he went, like, his life mission was to introduce the stations to as many people as possible, and he kind of is known for that, which is kind of cool. So yeah, but the scriptural ones are really kind of cool, and I just learned about them myself in studying for this podcast, and I was just going like, wow, this is really cool, and I'm excited actually to kind of go through it. It would change the images on the wall though drastically, you know what I mean, which would be interesting. So.
Yeah. So at the time when the Franciscans took over, they had care of the Holy Land, right?
Yeah.
Which they still do to this day. Oftentimes it switches. Yeah. Sometimes the Muslims are in charge of this area. Sometimes the Catholics, sometimes the Jews.
Yeah.
So I think now it's a difficult time there now anyways. But anyways, there were, that was the 14th century, and there were, I think, 7 recognized stations at the time. And they weren't even referred to, I don't think, as stations. But,
sacred way.
you could receive a plenary indulgence by going to meditate at these certain spots. So that's how it started, right? Like in the modern sort of way. They would go meditate at Pilate's home, for example. You know, they would go meditate, where Jesus met his mother. You know, like all these different places, and you would receive a plenary indulgence. Then you mentioned as high as like 30 stations were at one time. Imagine putting those up in our churches, right? Like running a wall space, right? But so there was, if people are wondering how we got to the modern 14 stations here, that happened by ordinance or order of Pope Clement XII. And that was in the 17th century, where he said, okay, 14 stations is like the regular way to go, right? And he fixed the number. He also permitted the stations to be created in all churches at the same time, because at one time it was only by specific permission that you were allowed to have these stations in certain churches, right? So he fixed the number of stations, and he permitted them in the churches. And then you saw this devotion really take off.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And I like how today you were saying like people don't really like to meditate always on just the passion and death of Jesus. That's why some places you go at a 15th station, and that's the resurrection, right? And nothing at all wrong with meditating on the resurrection,
No.
right? But the stations of the cross, right from if we're going to even take it back right to when Mary was just walking around those steps, those scenes, what do you think she was doing? She was reflecting on like the passion, like what her son went through, right? Yeah. Of course, in the back of our mind, the resurrection is always there.
Of course.
Right? And so we meditate on the stations of the cross and the passion and death of Jesus in light of always having the resurrection in the back of our mind, just like Mary would have done. Yeah. She would have been walking the steps. People would say, well, that was sad for her to do. But she would have been walking those steps, recounting what had happened, but knowing that the resurrection had happened. So adding a 15th station may have been just to cheer people up on the way out of the church, right? Like, we're going to end on the resurrection. But the number was set at 14 by the Holy Father in the year 1742.
There's suggestion that JP2 was the one that put the 15th station out there for the resurrection, but everything that I couldn't find a Vatican source on that one, and it doesn't make sense to me that he would do the 15th station, and then he would release the scriptural way of the cross and still keep it to 14 and not include the resurrection. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I don't think that, I think that's more rumor, and there are places that, like, there's a lot of churches that say that the 15th station is a JP2 thing and everything else, but I can't find any document that suggests it. So I think you're right. It might be, and if anybody has it, you can always email the Catholic Buzz and let us know. But it's one not to. The resurrection is what allows us to know with certainty that the crucifixion was our salvation. Because if it was just the crucifixion and then Jesus never rose from the dead, it would take a lot more faith, I'm going to say, to know that he died for our sins, if that makes sense. But the resurrection in itself is the miracle that happened to show us that Jesus died, like that he had the power over death, and that he gave himself on the cross. You know what I mean? And so that it's cool but when you're reflecting on where your salvation comes from, it doesn't come from the resurrection. It comes from the death on the cross, right?
Yeah, and the traditional 14 stations that we're talking about, if someone hasn't prayed them, there's the condemnation. Pilate condemns Jesus to death. Jesus carries the cross, number 2. Yeah. Number 3, the first fall. 4, Jesus meets his mother. 5, Simon of Cyrene helps carry the cross. 6, Veronica wipes the face of Jesus. 7, the second fall. 8, Jesus speaks to the women.
Weeping women.
9, the third fall. 10, Jesus is stripped of his garments. 11, he's nailed to the cross. 12, he dies on the cross. 13, he's taken down from the cross. And 14, he's laid in the tomb or sepulcher. And some of the things that I meditate when I pray the stations of the cross are always, we should reflect on each station, of course, for our own prayer life and our own growth in our spiritual life too. And you see some things in the stations that really highlight what Jesus went through, and then try to apply them to our life, right? Yeah. So we know near the end, Jesus is stripped of his garments, he's nailed to the cross, he's dies on the cross, he's taken down from the cross. These are all individual stations. Like we kind of think of them all in sort of one moment, but they're all individual things for us to reflect on. I also personally like how, the falls of Jesus are number 3, 7, and 9. And what does that mean? Well, when Jesus falls the first time, he's falling under the weight of the cross, right? But you see his second and third fall are closer together than his first and second. You can see the deterioration of Jesus on the way, and how can your heart not move and really reflecting on this, like, because people question, like, why are all 3 fall? Why couldn't there just be like
one
Jesus
big
falls?
Fall. Yeah.
Like, but it's like, well, we're walking the steps. Yeah. Like, here is where Veronica wiped his face. There's where he fell. Yeah. There, like, you can see people walking these steps and pointing these places out, right? And each of them are so significant for our our own spiritual maturity.
We were discussing this with the teens this week, actually, about specifically the falls, and we talked about the falls, and one of the things that was pointed out was that the first fall, just going through the first fall, but if you were to think about the first fall and where Jesus is at, he's just been scourged within an inch of his life, right? And we know all this kind of this stuff, but he's walking, and everybody around him, if you're looking at from John's eyes or from Mary's eyes, is like, okay, he's got this, but that first fall has got to be so hope draining. You know what I mean? Like, oh, like he has divine strength. Look at him go. You know, that kind of thing. Like no man could really do this, and then he falls, and then you're like, maybe he can't do this. Oh my goodness! They're beating him to get him up, and then they get him, and then like he well, not only that, he gets a helper, and then he falls again, even with the helper, and then we realize, this is Jesus in full humanity. His divinity, I'm going to say divine strength is not like a superpower, but like his strength is in the fact that he can keep going, not in the fact that he is able to lift this cross at the end of his life. But even with Simon helping him, he still fell. You know what I mean? And then the last fall, kind of completing that circle of three, that divine nature that he has, but lowering it to that point on the in humanity. Like this is him fully human here. Divine, three, but fully human. It's kind of cool. One of the cool things that you kind of mentioned that I thought was kind of interesting. We always recognize that Jesus dies on the 12th station, but the scriptural rosary, the scriptural way of the cross that JP2 introduced, has Jesus dying on the 13th station, which is always that the number 13 and all that other fun stuff. And so I just thought it was kind of interesting that they chose number 13 as that station, but it's that Jesus has the power of over anything. Doesn't matter what kind of superstition you have. And I think, that it is just a cool thing. So
I'd like, you mentioned St. Alphonsus Liguori's Way of the Cross.
Yeah.
One of the more popular ones, and you'd find that mostly in most churches celebrate St. Alphonsus Stations of the Cross. But there's just so much richness in that particular Stations of the Cross. Like, it's one of my favorites, and there's just a lot of things to meditate on that St. Alphonsus kind of highlights. Like one that sticks out for me always is when Veronica wipes the face of Jesus. St. Alphonsus writes for us to meditate on. He says, before you started this road, your face was beautiful, and now it's disfigured and bloody and all these things. And then St. Alphonsus kind of turns it around. He's like, just like my soul once was beautiful when I was baptized.
Wow, yeah.
And I have since disfigured it with my sins. And it's like, wow, these really beautiful things to reflect on as Jesus is walking these steps. Like so much spiritual goodness to come from them if we take our time to meditate them.
Yeah, I was going to say if we have the patience for it and the virtue of long suffering, like being willing to take our time with the stations, because again we have this kind of human tendency to rush through the unpleasant thing. So and even like I have sympathy for the the 31 stations of the cross. No, but like actually taking the opportunity to the ones that start at the Garden of Gethsemane, because this is something that's worth slowing down, reflecting on. There are versions that involve Jesus being sent to Herod because Pilate doesn't want to deal with him. Pilate doesn't want to have this kind of blood on his hands. Even slowing down and reflecting on each of the stages of Pilate's unwillingness to participate. Like again, putting yourself in that perspective. Pilate is an enigmatic figure in Scripture, just that his own internal conflict. We don't get the internal conflict of a lot of the characters in the Gospels. So again, just that even the Gospel narrative itself slows down on that point. It's like, okay, no, there's something really, really specific going on here that's worth reflecting on. So again, the devotion of the Stations of the Cross really forces us to slow down and take the time to contemplate each of these stages, again, on our way to a deeper appreciation of Christ's suffering and kind of the magnitude of how far God is willing to go to overcome our sin.
one of the cool things that just brings to mind whenever we kind of get into this Holy Week area, but specifically that is when I'm picturing those things, I'm picturing the movie The Passion of the Christ, because Mel Gibson and even the whole cast there at the time were going to daily mass, and they were really praying their way through creating that film. But one of the things that's kind of cool is you can see all the stations in that depiction of the Passion of the Christ. And so that tradition of the Stations of the Cross, even when we talk about Veronica, it's not scriptural, but we do have some traditionally based, and it goes all the way back. That's in there. We have the Weeping Women. We have, well, I guess that's more scriptural based, but the different area, the falls. Yeah. Jesus falls 3 times in that, getting up, and he falls more and worse as he goes. Yeah. But then anyways, just those images come to mind. When we talk about the disfigured face, I think of that face of in the Passion of the Christ, how disfigured it was at the time. And it's I really find it's an awesome time for us to meditate and just depict on like, holy cow, this is what you did for me. You know what I mean? Like this is amazing. How much you loved, but also that I'm worth this. You know what I mean?
That was probably my first exposure to the Stations of the Cross, because I saw that film before I became Catholic, or before Catholicism was even on my radar. So, and again, at the time, I was pretty well acquainted with the gospel narrative. So, at the time, I just wrote it off as artistic license, or like he's just kind of padding the narrative because you have to make a full length feature film here. But when I started doing RCIA and learning about it, I'm like, oh, okay, no, these are actually part of the tradition or part of the process. And it added, and again, the film is beautifully structured around the stations themselves. Like it actually makes a point of, these are significant milestones kind of along the way. But up until that point, like my only, reference point was, I don't know if you know the Ray Boltz song, Watch the Lamb, but we do at ministries that I was involved in, we'd do this skit, and it would just be like, you put yourself in the perspective of Simon and of Cyrene. The stations have a much deeper and much more, I would say significant treatment of Christ's passion than anything I'd experienced up to that point.
Yeah, it's a real beautiful way to reflect on the steps of Jesus. I think whether you're praying with St. Alphonsus's Way of the Cross, or Mary's Way of the Cross, JP2 scriptural Stations of the Cross, I think just if you haven't already during the season of Lent, to take time to pray with them. Whether it's inside of your church or just in your own prayer time to reflect on the stations, I think is a beautiful thing. JP2 scriptural stations, you can even read the scriptures that he recommends there for the 14 stations. I think it would be a beautiful reflection before Holy Week or even during Holy Week. So I think there's fruit there. I think when we give it time to reflect on those things, that I think that there's much fruit to be borne by reflecting on the passion of Jesus. So that's all the time we have today. But I hope that the stations brings great spiritual insight to the last part of our Lenten journey. So if you want to drop us a line about your favorite stations or something that you've been moved by, you can write us at askus@thecatholicbuzz.com. Or you just like this video as well. That's all the time we have today. So for Josh Sullivan and Matt Van Milligan, my name is Father Daniele. We'll see you next time on The Catholic Buzz.